Welcome back. I'm Dr. C, and I'm searching for the Past and Future box, one of 5 boxes that John Collins Black has hid across the United States and provided clues to find those treasures inside his book, There's Treasure Inside. Today we're covering Chapter 13 once again. If you haven't caught Part 1 and Part 2 yet, I suggest you do so. But I'll go into a quick review before we move on to today's topic. So in the chapter, I located these clues. In history, only 4. At least 270 more. John chose 270, which happens to be the exact number of electoral votes you need to become president of the United States. He moved on to say, the best at what they do, the president of the United States. And also presidential. And later he mentioned memorabilia and dollar, which hints to George Washington. I then took that information, and I believe that he was referring to Mount Rushmore. In history, only 4. The best at what they do. President of the United States, George Washington. So I went ahead and took the image of Mount Rushmore and lined it up with the illustration located in that chapter. And I went on to point out how many points tended to line up. Even though I probably didn't have the exact image that John used, things were falling into place pretty well. I like the way that the head rested on the mountain, the way that the arm and the finger sort of cupped the faces, the way that the legs sort of drooped down and matched the mountain there, and then this kind of black blob matched the trees that were right there. And, see what you think for yourself. But again, I wouldn't have got to Mount Rushmore if it wouldn't have been for the chapter clues to go ahead and take a look. And also, Mount Rushmore, highly photographed, many angles, but there is a place where you go to look out and see Mount Rushmore. So a lot of the pictures are kind of from the same angle. And it seems to me like this fits in pretty well. Again, I want to remind everybody that a lot of this stems from simply watching There's Treasure Inside, the Unofficial podcast, and them covering some of these topics, and then me coming in and just kind of giving my 2 cents worth. So I really want to give them credit because they're really doing the grunt work, and they're putting the time in, and they're coming up with these ideas, putting the 1,000-piece puzzle together, and I'm kind of walking up going, hey, those 2 pieces seem like they fit together. So really, I think they're doing most of the work here. So I want to just let them know that I appreciate what they're doing. And these little segments will kind of be called springboards. So I'll always kind of reference, hey, this is something they did. I'll put a link in the description below to any video that this references. But I want to make sure that when I'm talking about the stuff that they covered, that I highlight their logo and make sure that they get credit for this is their work. And then it'll go on to, maybe if I go on to another topic or start sharing my ideas, it'll be reflected with, Dr. C up in the corner. So you'll know that I'm kind of moving on, springboarding from their ideas onto my own. Let's go and begin. So they were talking about triangular numbers, and they came across these numbers that were mentioned when John started talking about the basketball game. Chapter 13, page 120 and 121. We led by 10 points in the first quarter and 15 in the second. At the end of the third quarter, our lead had ballooned to 21 points. With 2 minutes and 34 seconds remaining in the game, we led by 28 points. They were able to spot these numbers. Now, the chapter is full of all sorts of numbers. So how did they come across these ones, right? They were just able to notice, all right, we got 10, we got 15, we got 21, and with 2 minutes and 34 seconds left in the fourth quarter, we have 28. And what Blake was able to notice was that these are triangular numbers. And we'll get into that in more detail in just a minute, and I'll explain what they saw. But first, how do we know that these are the important numbers, right? I mean, great pattern recognition, way to spot these numbers for sure. But is John somehow telling us among all the numbers that are in the chapter, why are these ones important? Let me show you. So if we go to page 116, the beginning of the chapter, he was already the most famous basketball player in the world and well on his way to becoming the greatest player ever. He was the basketball 007, never stirred, never shaken. Jordan was at his best under the brightest lights. Now, this is interesting because he brings up 007 again. This is something he mentions in chapter 1. And I think this is a call out to tell you, hey, it's time to be like a spy. It's time to look for something cryptic, right? And then he goes on to say, let's go and highlight that there, 007. Then he goes on to say, Jordan was at his best under the brightest lights. This is important. This is a tie-in. This is a word weave just beginning. Okay? Later, on page 121, it reads, I walked across the court and stood at the free throw lane next to my teammate who was preparing to take a foul shot. I looked up at the clock. Its red electronic numbers burned bright. So, John is wanting us to look at the clock because he's tying it in with the 007 and the bright lights. Okay? Burned bright. Now let's go ahead and explain what Blake was talking about in the episode. So basically, triangular numbers are formed by adding successive natural numbers like 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, creating a sequence like 1 plus 2. Let's show you that here. So we have 1, right? We want to add numbers 2, 3, 4, 5. And these form equilateral triangles of dots. Okay, so 1 plus 2 equals 3. Then you would take that number, 3 plus 3 becomes 6. Then you go ahead and add 4, and that becomes 10. And then you add 5, and that becomes 15, and so on. There's a famous story that ties into triangular numbers. There once was this kid, Carl Friedrich Gauss. When Gauss was in 3rd grade, his teacher asked the class to add up all the numbers from 1 to 100, probably a task to keep the kids busy. But Gauss quickly noticed a pattern. If you pair the numbers from the start and end, they all add to the same sum. So if you take 1 and 100, and you pair those, it becomes 101. Then 2 and 99 becomes 101. 3 and 98 is 101, and so on. There are 50 such pairs, each summing to 101. So instead of adding each number one by one, Gauss multiplied 50 times 101 and got the number 5050. Okay, 5050. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at page 118, it begins, I acquired the card pictured on the previous spread, page 112, for our treasure from PWCC, the largest sports card broker in the world. Brent Huggins, apologize if I mispronounced that, the owner of PWCC, said the following about his card. Now, I'm going to stop there because an interesting thing here, and I don't know if this has been pointed out by anybody, page 112. It's actually on page 115 is where the card's located. So what's on page 112, right? Is 112 important? Is 115 important? Is this just a mistake? So we'll come back to this later. But right now I want to continue on. And I just clipped a blurb of what he had to say about it. And I don't know if this is something that John manipulated, utilized, or whatnot, but he says, we've awarded it our superior certification, completely packed fresh with 50-50 alignment, dagger sharp corners, and gem mint cardstock. So 50-50, this ties in with our 100th triangular number from Gauss, right? Now, what's interesting about that 3rd grade kid, he turned out to become the prince of mathematicians. His work shaped huge parts of modern math and science in ways that still show up everywhere. You recognize the name Gauss? Gaussian? Well, anybody that's used Photoshop for the last 30 years, they would be familiar with Gaussian blur. Now, for the last 30 years, I've called it Gaussian blur. Can't get that out of my head, so I'm trying to adjust Gaussian. Anyways, so it's an image processing technique, and what it does is it applies a mathematical function to average the pixels based on their spatial relationship. Okay, so I mean everybody's probably blurred an image. It takes the main pixel and then blurs it outward to its surrounding areas. If that makes any sense. The interesting part that you need to take away from this is the bell curve. Okay. Now, we just mentioned a couple things, right? So let's take a look in the chapter. What ties in with this? Page 119. That week of tryouts was a blur. At some point, I got past the humiliation of wearing jeans the first day. Blur. Okay. We were just talking about the Gaussian blur. Okay. And this part interests me too. And I think this is probably something that needs to be dove in deeper at some point and try out. Since Gaussian blur ties into the triangular numbers, do you think that there's some sort of try out, some sort of point or a triangle? Maybe triangulation. I know a couple people I talk to that every time I bring up some location or some ideas, they come to me and say, I've got an idea. And I'm like, what is it? And they're like, let's triangulate that. So they're dying to triangulate something. And I always roll my eyes. But one of these days, there's going to be something that's going to be triangulated, and I will eat my words. All right. So let's continue on. Later, it reads, when the end of the day bell finally rang, I let go of a breath of relief. Now, bell, at least in part one anyways, it's the only time this word shows up. And it happens to tie in with our bell curve. Okay? Here's something interesting though. Look how the sentence ends. I let go a breath of relief. Who says that? I let go a sigh of relief. That's the more common, right? I thought this was interesting. A breath. Let's just go and grab that for just a second. I think a breath sounds like Abe, okay? While Carl Friedrich Gauss is often credited because he used the bell-shaped curve for analyzing data, leading it to being named the Gaussian distribution, the bell curve traces its roots to 1733 to Abraham de Moivre, a French mathematician known for his work with probability theory and normal distribution. Living in London as a refugee, he earned a meager living by acting as a consultant to gamblers and coffee houses by calculating the odds of complex gambling outcomes. So I did a little reading on this, and he was looking at how probabilities of coin flips and rolling dice, and he would consult on whether or not some die were loaded, was something happening where it shouldn't? Was it outside of the curve? Does that make sense? So anyways, if you have time and you want to really dive into bell curve or Gaussian distribution, I suggest you do so, because knowing this information might be important to solve the mystery in chapter 13. So far, we've been collecting a lot of variables, right? And let's go ahead and try to see if we can solve this problem. You might come up with something different, of course. I haven't put a lot of thought into this, but this is what struck me pretty quickly, all right? So again, thanks to There's Treasure Inside, the Unofficial podcast, they springboarded this idea. Basically, they recognized that the number 10, add 5 is 15, add 6 is 21, add 7 is 28. And they picked up on that was triangular numbers. They also went as far as looking at the 234 and thought, well, maybe you add the 2 to the 34, and that gives us our next number. 36. And that then continues our path to the right as we add numbers. And this sort of ties in a little bit to Gauss on how he was able to go all the way out to 100 triangular numbers, and he recognized patterns and he was able to kind of figure it out, right? And maybe that's why John introduces Gauss, is to kind of be like, figure it out, recognize the patterns, come up with a solution. So let's go ahead and take one moment to take a look at the story. I'm not going to read it to you, but hopefully you did get a chance to read it. What I want to ask you guys is I want you to think about the story you read about John going in for the first time and walking up to the free throw line and maybe noticing some people in the audience. And then he ends up getting the rebound, dribbles down the court, finds a free lane, and he does a layup and scores 2 points for the other team, right? What I want to ask you to think about is, how did you visualize this story? So I talked to my wife about this and my brother, and we're all in the same boat. Like we have like movies playing in our head all the time, right? So when you read something, you've got the movie kind of playing out. And for me, when I read it, and maybe I was already kind of had some information that I was able to kind of piece it together beforehand. But when I was watching it, I'm thinking of being at a high school basketball game. And generally, you're in the home crowd and you're sitting behind your team. So they would get up and they would walk over, and here's John, right? And he's about to go in. And then I pictured John just sort of coming up to the free throw line. And he was facing away from me in my visualization. But you know what? He started talking about people in the audience, things like that. And maybe he's on this side, or maybe he's on this side of the free throw line, right? So that he can kind of see some people that he knows, a couple girls in the audience, that kind of thing. But again, I saw it this way, where he was kind of in the front. And I asked my wife, I said, how did you see it? And she's like, well, I saw him and his team, being on the other side of the court. And I asked her, I said, well, that's maybe because you watch a lot of NBA games and they've got both teams on the far side and the cameras kind of see them. And when they come in, you see them and they go to the side. And I was like, what side did you think they went on? She's like, well, he went to, she said she went to her left side maybe, and maybe she was saying right. I know it was opposite of mine until I talked to her a little bit further and she's like, oh, I see what you're seeing. So anyways, we'll come back to that, but let's go ahead and put John in the right place, even though I didn't visualize it this way. And he basically he gets the rebound and he runs down the court, right? And he jumps up and he shoots the basket. He was going the wrong direction, right? He was going to the right. And I know this because the image in the book, it shows him doing a layup and he looks like he's doing it to my right. So he must have been traveling from left to right, just as we were doing when we were actually doing our triangular numbers. We were moving from left to right. And I think John tells the story, for his sake, I hope it's made up because I feel bad for him. But, funny story nonetheless, is that he was going the wrong way. He's telling you that from left to right is the wrong way, right? The correct way is he should have been going from right to left. He should have been going that way. Let's see how that plays in. So we're back here, and what I always thought was that we've got the 5, 6, 7, 8, right? And he's giving us the 2, 3, 4. So I kind of pictured it this way. I was like, hey, maybe he wants us to fill in the gap here. And we've got our 2, 3, and 4, right? And our job is to solve for the missing numbers, okay? And we get 1, 3, 6. I think this is the number he wanted us to find. Now, what you do with that is up to you. I mean, a lot of different things. So 1 sometimes can be converted into an I in Roman numerals. And we know he uses Roman numerals in some of his other parts of the puzzle. So it could be I-36, right? You might look at it and go, okay, well, we were dealing with Mount Rushmore. So maybe the 1 is, George Washington, the first president. 3 is Jefferson, the third president. So maybe that's kind of what you need to look at it. So let's take a look at the 1, 3, 6, right? And let's kind of digest everything that we've done. And some might call this like a rabbit hole, right? But it's not really a rabbit hole. It's more like an Easter egg hunt, because we went around and just sort of skimmed the surface. We picked up all of these things. We didn't go that deep. He gave us a lot of this information just on the surface, right? So he gave us direction to get to the triangular numbers. He mentions the 50-50, which ties into triangular numbers when talking about Carl Friedrich Gauss. And then blur. And that also ties in with Gaussian blur. And how's that accomplished? With a bell curve, and Bell's brought into the chapter. Now these, some people go, you're just randomly making connections. That might be true, okay? I kind of grabbed at this a breath. I thought that seemed odd writing, but it led me to Abe, and it led me to look further into the bell curve and find Abraham, right? If we go back to the previous parts when I discussed the Mount Rushmore with foreign history, presidents of the United States, Mount Rushmore, right? And I started looking at this 136, and then we're talking about triangular numbers. And 136 is actually the 16th triangular number. So I believe that we were meant to look at Mount Rushmore and the 16th number, and we were to discover, and also the bell curve, Abraham, Dumoirv, and we were meant to actually convert this to an Abraham Lincoln clue. Okay, that's as far as I've got with this. And I think it's interesting, if anybody's working on the past and future box, and if you haven't already discovered the tie-ins with George Washington, it seems pretty apparent to me. Some of you have them in your solve, some of you don't. Some of you should consider maybe putting it in there. I do have a coin solve that I'm interested in sharing with everybody. It involves all 4 coins. So I'll be curious, even people working on other boxes, how my coin solution that I will present, hopefully I'll have it in a video here shortly, ties in to each of your solves, right? I mean, I'm not really looking at the other boxes, so if it somehow helps you find your box, we'll call it your box, because I'm not looking at it, right? I'm not trying to get all these. I don't even know if I'm trying to get one, so we'll see. But anyways, this is what I came up with. I'm curious to see if you guys all see these same connections, if you are scooping up these Easter eggs, what you're making of it. I didn't mention, but bell, could lead to maybe a bell of some sort, right? Like a church or something like that. I'm not sure. But it seems like it's important. And then also back, I didn't cover it here, but that try out a triangular point or something of that sort. I'm curious to see if you guys come up with anything with that. Maybe I'll toss it back to There's Treasure Inside, the Unofficial podcast, and be like, hey guys, what are you going to do with this? Because I don't know. So who knows? I'm sure they're smart. They're smart people. They'll probably figure something out. All right. I promised that we would circle back to this. The typo or error when he mentions page 112, when it's actually 115, the card appears on. So maybe he's leading us to 112. And the first line at the top of that page does say young men from San Francisco began traveling east. Maybe he's giving us that direction clue in regards to look at the direction you're traveling, right? And that you're traveling east. Maybe this is actually telling us to go the other way, opposite of what I said, but I don't think that's the case. I think this is just a clue to tie us into traveling or moving in a direction. And actually, if you keep going down, he mentions another president, so that's kind of being brought back into it. President Polk. I'd have to go through and read further, but maybe you can come up with some connections to page 112 and see if that helps you any further. But this is about as far as I'm going to take this today. If you notice the difference between the first half of the video and the second half of the video, it's the difference between recording at 2 a.m. at the night and then recording at 9 a.m. the next morning. So I do apologize if you had to kind of push through that first part. All right, that's it for today. I appreciate you watching. And if you could, leave a comment. Let me know what you think about all this. Take care.